There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. Those were the words of billionaire Warren Buffett, and in a way, he was right. This is the story of a system built on personal ambition and entrepreneurial freedom, a system that celebrates the individual who dares, who dreams, who builds. But in such a system, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few isn't an accident. It's the natural consequence. For a time, the United States tried to keep that force in check. It banned monopolies. It taxed fortunes. But over the past 40 years, American capitalism has begun to spin out of control. Across the economy, enormous clusters of capital have formed, choking off competition. And politics? It barely flinched. Today, 722 billionaires and 22 million millionaires in the U.S. legally pay less tax than their own secretaries. The situation is so absurd that even some millionaires have started to protest, though usually only until they're reminded of what it would actually cost them. Within just 4 decades, the wealthy have taken ownership of America. Or rather, they've taken it back. Because this story begins much earlier, more than a century ago. It's the end of the 19th century. Tonight, New York's 400 richest families are preparing for a costume ball that will outshine even the grandest parties of Europe's old aristocracy. The venue is the Waldorf Astoria, the largest hotel in New York, rented in its entirety for the occasion. According to the New York Times, the budget for this single night could feed 6,000 New York families for an entire year. Police are nervous. Many New Yorkers can barely afford to eat, and the sight of the wealthy parading in powdered wigs and silk stockings is too much to stomach. 800 officers are deployed to keep the crowds away from the hotel's entrance as the curious masses press forward to watch the elite arrive. Men and women dressed as kings, queens, and courtiers of old Europe. Inside, the champagne flows. 4,000 bottles are emptied before dawn. Guests dine on 28 courses, dance until morning, and then leave the Waldorf in ruins for the staff to clean up. In just 20 years, a new class of millionaires has conquered America, and they have no intention of giving it back. Among them are 3 men who tower over the age: John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. Rockefeller was the first and the richest. His fortune began with the purchase of a small oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. At the time, around 1870, there were about 30 refineries in the city. Too much competition for Rockefeller's liking. He struck a secret deal with the railroads, the lifeblood of the oil trade, to ship his barrels at lower rates than anyone else's. With cheaper transport, he could undercut every rival until, one by one, they either sold to him or went out of business. Within 2 years, Standard Oil had devoured Cleveland's entire refining industry. Soon, it controlled 90% of all American oil. Rockefeller's monopoly allowed him to dictate prices at will, and his fortune exploded. By 1883, the New York Times estimated his wealth at $129 million, an unimaginable sum, greater than the budgets of many nations. Though he ruled the largest monopoly in America, one more powerful than the government itself. Not a word ever leaked about the methods he used to rob the public blind. And yet Rockefeller remained, in his mind, a righteous man. In his Cleveland mansion, a Bible always within reach, he insisted he was accountable to no one, except God. Andrew Carnegie's story began very differently. Born in Scotland to a poor weaver, he emigrated to America at the age of 13. By 29, he was a railroad executive, a self-made man in the purest sense. Carnegie embodied the great American dream. Anyone could become a millionaire, so long as they worked hard enough. And when he built a state-of-the-art steel mill outside Pittsburgh, that dream took shape in steel and smoke. The railroads needed vast amounts of metal, and steel was gold. But Carnegie was already thinking bigger. He believed his steel would one day allow American cities to rise into the sky. Pittsburgh became a symbol of raw industrial power, the beating heart of progress. And Carnegie became one of the wealthiest men alive. But success brought with it an uneasy question. What was the purpose of such wealth? Why him and not someone else? In 1889, Carnegie wrote an essay that shook the nation, The Gospel of Wealth. He argued that inequality was natural, even beneficial. Only the most capable could rise to the top. But those who did had a moral duty, to use their fortunes for the public good. The rich, he said, should die poor, giving away their entire wealth to build libraries, universities, hospitals. Let the rich become as rich as possible, so that they can distribute their money as wisely as possible. That, he said, was the gospel according to Andrew Carnegie. Rockefeller, ever the rival, quickly took note. In 1889, the New York Times reported that he had donated $1 million to the University of Chicago, a sum that instantly earned him an honorary doctorate. Carnegie's gospel became the new Bible of the millionaire class. It freed them from debates about inequality by declaring it inevitable, even virtuous. It flattered them, too, by proclaiming them society's natural benefactors, the ones who knew best how to improve humanity. Philanthropy became America's national sport. Each year, newspapers ranked the country's top donors. To be absent from that list was unthinkable. If John D. Rockefeller ruled oil and Andrew Carnegie ruled steel, then finance itself had a king, and his name was John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the banker of the age, the man who held the American economy in his thick, gloved hands. He was often caricatured in newspapers as a naval officer, partly because he loved to pose on the deck of his 50-meter yacht, the Corsair, but also because in his own way he commanded a fleet. 9 out of 10 immigrants who arrived in America came aboard ships that belonged to him. Morgan's face was unforgettable. A hereditary condition had left his nose deformed, and he used that physical flaw as a weapon, leaning in close to intimidate anyone who crossed him. He hated journalists, loathed photographers, and tolerated no scrutiny. The railroads, the mines, the telegraph, electricity itself, all bore his fingerprints. Only 2 industries stood beyond his reach, Rockefeller's oil and Carnegie's steel. But Morgan had something no one else possessed, the trust of Europe's financiers. When bankers in London, Paris, or Berlin wanted to invest in the booming American economy, they turned not to Washington, but to Morgan. His bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, based at 23 Wall Street, became the beating heart of America's Industrial Revolution. It was a lender, a shareholder, and an unofficial central bank, all in one. Yet Morgan preferred to conduct his real business in the private halls of his mansion on Madison Avenue. It was there he summoned the owners of America's railroads, men whose companies were locked in ruinous price wars that threatened them all. "Your companies," Morgan barked, "belong to my clients." Then he demanded immediate mergers, forcing them to unite under his control. The outcome: regional monopolies that stabilized prices and vastly increased profits. Despite the near-total domination of America's millionaires, the country still called itself a democracy. 2 great parties shared power. The Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, had become the party of industry, of businessmen, of order. The Democrats stood for everything else: the farmers, the workers, the South. But in the United States Senate, politics had long been reduced to a luxury hobby. As the New York Times dryly reported in 1890, another millionaire in the Senate. Mr. Price has never held public office. He bought his seat as he might have bought an opera box, a yacht, or any other luxury he desired. The Senate, indirectly elected and shielded from the public, had become the Millionaires' Club. Republican or Democrat, its members blocked every law that might threaten their interests. By the 1890s, America was a paradise for the wealthy. No income tax, no inheritance tax, no labor laws, no rights for unions, and no regulation for banks. A steady stream of immigrants poured in, millions from Europe, chasing the same shimmering dream: freedom and prosperity. But what they found was a world ruled by capital. Then, suddenly, the dream cracked. A wave of economic crises swept through the country. Factories closed, wages collapsed. Strikes broke out everywhere. The unions tried to fight back, demanding contracts, fair pay, a voice. But the police were on the side of the bosses, and when the police couldn't handle it, the army was sent in. Bayonets fixed. Andrew Carnegie himself, the benevolent philanthropist, ordered soldiers to open fire on striking workers at one of his steel plants. 15 men were killed. Carnegie defended himself by saying he had merely protected his private property. The brutality shocked the nation. Writers, journalists, and reformers began to denounce what they called the excesses of American capitalism. A new movement was born: progressivism. The progressives argued that America's millionaires were not aristocrats with divine rights. They were citizens like anyone else, and they owed the nation accountability. They found allies among politicians disgusted by the stranglehold of wealth on democracy. The progressives were appalled by the misery they saw in this rich nation, above all by the sight of children toiling in factories. As the 1896 presidential election approached, they demanded an end to what they called the tyranny of the millionaires. For the first time, one of the two major parties decided to listen. The Democrats chose a young, passionate candidate named William Jennings Bryan. He embraced the demands of the progressives and the unions alike: an 8-hour workday, nationalized railroads, bank regulation, the breakup of monopolies, and an income tax for the rich. For months, Bryan traveled across the country, city by city, town by town. His message was simple and fiery: reform, or preserve a system corrupted by money. America, he said, stood at a crossroads. His campaign sent waves of panic through the salons of the rich. For the first time, democracy itself threatened their privileges. Some whispered openly about whether the vote of the masses had been a mistake. Their anxiety deepened when the Republican candidate, William McKinley, ran a half-hearted campaign from his front porch in Ohio. But McKinley's campaign manager, businessman Mark Hanna, had a plan. "There are two important things in politics," Hanna said. "The first is money, and I can't remember what the second is." Hanna went knocking on the doors of America's richest men. "The Republican Party," he told them, "exists to defend your interests. But that kind of defense isn't free. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, they all paid up. Rockefeller, as always, insisted on being the most generous." With Hanna's help, a flood of money poured into McKinley's campaign. He had 7 times more funds than Bryan, enough to organize the largest political marketing campaign America had ever seen. The slogans were simple and irresistible: commerce, civilization, prosperity. Hanna even arranged for McKinley to be filmed, presenting him as calm, dignified, and presidential. The first political advertisement in American history. When the votes were counted, the map told a strange story. Most of the country was blue, Democratic blue, but the industrial Northeast, the most populous region, was Republican red. And that was enough. McKinley won by a landslide in the Electoral College, 271 to 176. The Millionaires had triumphed. As President McKinley took office, the stock market cheered. The Democrats, humiliated, swore never again to question the system itself. That same year, a cigarette company named Admiral launched the world's first film commercial. The message was clear. America had chosen its path. Commerce was king. The dawn of the 20th century arrived gilded in wealth and ambition. The age of the millionaire had become the age of dynasties. On a crisp October morning in 1901, society pages across America announced the marriage of Abby Aldrich, daughter of powerful Senator Nelson Aldrich, to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the only son of John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the world. It was more than a wedding. It was a merger. Senator Aldrich was the Republican Party's most powerful figure, known in Washington as the general manager of the nation. No federal law could pass without his blessing. By uniting their families, Aldrich and Rockefeller forged a strategic alliance between money and politics, sealing the foundation of a dynasty that would shape America for generations. From their lineage would come governors, bankers, and even a vice president of the United States. Each of them, true to family tradition, would call themselves philanthropists. While the Rockefellers consolidated their social power, J.P. Morgan was about to consolidate America's industry. He invited Andrew Carnegie to his Madison Avenue mansion for a private meeting. Morgan wanted to buy Carnegie's entire steel empire. Carnegie scribbled a number on a piece of paper. His price, $480 million. Morgan glanced at the paper and smiled. "Congratulations, Andrew," he said. "You are now the richest man in the world." Carnegie chuckled. "You would have paid $100 million more, wouldn't you?" Morgan nodded. "Yes, I would." And just like that, the biggest industrial deal in history was done. Carnegie, now the richest retiree alive, turned his attention fully to philanthropy, endowing libraries, universities, and foundations bearing his name. Morgan, meanwhile, fused the Carnegie Empire with other steel companies to create a single giant, U.S. Steel. Its value was staggering, $1.5 billion. It controlled 213 plants, 41 mines, and 170,000 workers. 70% of all American steel flowed through Morgan's hands. He appointed Charles Schwab, a former Carnegie employee, as president, the first American worker to earn more than $1 million a year. Even Rockefeller Jr., fresh from his wedding, was offered a seat on U.S. Steel's board. The new century belonged to men like these, men who thought in billions, who bent industries to their will. Their steel would soon reshape the skyline of New York itself. At 175 Fifth Avenue, the Flatiron Building rose into the air, its sharp wedge of steel and stone soaring 87 meters high. It was unlike anything the world had seen, a new architecture for a new age. Then came the Equitable Building, twin towers reaching 164 meters, with more than 1 million square feet of office space. "We've created a new continent," one of its builders boasted. The Singer Building followed, 187 meters high, only to be eclipsed months later by the Metropolitan Life Tower, its 213-meter spire inspired by the campanile of Venice's St. Mark's Square. And in 1913, the Woolworth Building surpassed them all. a neo-Gothic cathedral of commerce, 55 stories high, dedicated not to God, but to business. New York's skyline became the modern world's new cathedral, a monument to ambition and to money, and it sent an unmistakable message to the rest of America. This is where the future is being built. But not everyone shared in the triumph. In 1902, a modest shoe manufacturer named Henry Endicott faced a problem. His company in New York employed 10,000 workers, but turnover was crippling production. So he decided to try something radical. He shortened the workday to 8 hours and raised wages. The result? Within weeks, no one quit. Productivity soared, and profits reached record highs. Workers lined up to join Endicott's company, one of the only places in America where social peace seemed possible. In a world that glorified exploitation, his experiment was revolutionary. Yet the true transformation of capitalism came not from shoes or steel, but from a machine, the automobile. Cars were still handcrafted luxuries for the rich. Then a man named Henry Ford changed everything. Ford loathed unions and despised the progressives. But he had learned one crucial lesson from Endicott. Pay well enough, and workers will obey. He doubled the average wage in his factories. On one condition: no unions, and absolute obedience to the rhythm of the assembly line. It worked. Mass production slashed the cost of a car in half. The Model T became the vehicle of the American everyman, affordable, reliable, unstoppable. And for every car that rolled off Ford's line, there was another winner, John D. Rockefeller. Cars needed gasoline, and gasoline came from oil. Standard Oil's monopoly made Rockefeller the world's first billionaire. By 1906, the Vanderbilt Cup, America's first great automobile race, was being run at an average speed of nearly 100 kilometers an hour. The age of speed had arrived, and with it, a growing unease. Because one man, President Theodore Roosevelt, had begun to see the dark side of the new industrial empire. A Republican himself, Roosevelt was no socialist, but he believed the unchecked monopolies had become a brake on progress. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, had long lain dormant. Roosevelt decided it was time to use it. His target? Rockefeller's Standard Oil. It was a declaration of war. Rockefeller unleashed an army of lawyers to defend his empire, but Roosevelt didn't back down. The battle would last for years, a legal war fought in headlines and courtrooms. Then, in October 1907, the financial system cracked. A sudden panic struck Wall Street. Within hours, stock prices plummeted by 50%. Banks began to fail. Depositors rushed to withdraw their savings. America teetered on the edge of collapse. And, once again, the government turned, not to Congress, not to the Treasury, but to one man, J. P. Morgan. Morgan gathered the nation's bankers in his Madison Avenue mansion. He handed them a sheet of paper listing the sums each would have to contribute to rescue the system. "None of you," he said quietly, "will leave this room until you have signed." They signed, and by the next morning the panic was over. A letter published in the New York Times captured the nation's mood. "For once, we need a man in the White House who is neither an egotist nor a politician, but a businessman who knows what he's doing. J. P. Morgan for president." The message was clear. In America, real power didn't sit in Washington. It lived on Wall Street. J. P. Morgan's rescue of the American banking system in 1907 had a clear lesson. In times of crisis, it wasn't the government that saved capitalism. It was capital itself. Morgan had proven that the real seat of power in America was not the White House, but the drawing room of his Madison Avenue mansion. And yet, for the first time in decades, that power was about to be challenged. After years of courtroom battles, Theodore Roosevelt's case against Standard Oil finally reached its conclusion. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court declared that Rockefeller's empire was in violation of antitrust law. The judgment was historic. Standard Oil would be broken up into 34 separate companies. But in the end, the victory was more symbolic than real. There were no fines, no personal consequences. And because Rockefeller held shares in Standard Oil, he automatically became a shareholder in each of the new companies. His fortune didn't shrink, it multiplied. Still, Roosevelt's success emboldened reformers. They set their sights on U.S. Steel, Morgan's towering colossus, in which the Rockefellers also held major stakes. In October 1911, the Justice Department filed suit against Morgan, Rockefeller, and Rockefeller Jr., accusing them of violating the Antitrust Act. While their lawyers prepared to fight, Morgan decided to demolish and rebuild the headquarters of his bank, simply because he no longer liked the building's style. Years dragged by. The case wound its way through the courts, from ruling to appeal to the Supreme Court itself. But this time, the winds of justice had shifted. Many judges, and even much of the public, believed that big business was good for the nation. That concentration of capital was not corruption, but progress. And so, in the end, the case was dismissed. U.S. Steel survived intact. By then, J.P. Morgan was gone. He died in 1913, mourned as both a savior and a tyrant. The markets barely flinched. His son, J.P. Morgan, Jr., had long been groomed to take his place. But 5 months before the old banker's death, America had quietly changed direction. For the first time in 20 years, and only the second time in its history, the country elected a Democrat to the White House. His name was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a progressive. He believed that the stranglehold of the rich on American life had to be broken, and this time he had a Congress that agreed with him. His reforms came swiftly. First, he created the Federal Reserve System, a true central bank, ending the era in which Morgan's private firm had acted as the nation's lender of last resort. Second, he pushed through a constitutional amendment to ensure that senators would henceforth be elected directly by the people, not appointed by state legislatures or bought by millionaires. Third, he outlawed child labor, ending a 30-year battle fought by the progressives. And finally, he introduced something unthinkable in the golden halls of the wealthy: a federal income tax. Only the richest 4% of Americans would pay it, with a top rate of 7%. But the symbolism was powerful. For the first time, the fortunes of men like Rockefeller would be taxed by the state. Rockefeller, of course, had no intention of letting that happen. He found a loophole, and in the process, invented a new kind of power. In April 1913, the Senate passed a law officially recognizing the Rockefeller Foundation. Its mission, according to its charter, was to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. 2 weeks later, senators were already raising alarms. They accused both the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations of turning charity into a business, of using philanthropy as a means of control. And they were right. With one stroke, Rockefeller and Carnegie had succeeded in exempting all philanthropic funds from income tax. They could now transfer as much of their wealth as they wished, even their private art collections and European estates, into charitable foundations, shielded from the reach of the Treasury. It was the perfect system: give and never lose. Donate and still control. Generosity had become the ultimate tax shelter. While Congress congratulated itself on reform, real power remained where it had always been, in the hands of the wealthy. In April 1914, the illusion shattered. In the mining town of Ludlow, Colorado, coal miners had been on strike for months. They demanded recognition of their union, a request that John D. Rockefeller, Jr., principal shareholder of the mine, flatly refused. Most of the miners were recent immigrants. They spoke little English and had no citizenship. To the Colorado National Guard, they were nobodies. One spring morning, the soldiers attacked the strikers' camp. They set fire to the tents and opened fire on the fleeing workers. 13 miners were shot dead. When the ashes cooled, rescuers found the charred bodies of 11 children and 2 women. The Ludlow Massacre, as it came to be known, ignited outrage across America. Crowds gathered outside Rockefeller headquarters in New York, demanding justice. Rockefeller Jr. was called before a congressional committee. He faced no punishment. He was, after all, a Rockefeller. But his father was furious that anyone dared question their right to defend their property. He publicly declared there was nothing wrong with shooting at Unionists. The press turned on him with fury. To restore his image, Rockefeller doubled his philanthropic donations, scattering millions across the country in the name of goodwill. It worked, for a time. But soon the headlines shifted. A far greater storm was gathering. In August 1914, World War I erupted in Europe. Though the United States remained neutral, the shockwaves hit immediately. Prices soared. Inflation gutted the value of the dollar. Retailers and manufacturers searched for ways to keep their businesses alive. Until then, Americans had bought their groceries by handing lists to a clerk who gathered each item for them. A slow and costly process. In Memphis, Tennessee, a grocer named Clarence Saunders decided to try something new. He opened a store where customers could pick up their own goods directly from the shelves, fill a basket, and pay at the counter. He called it Piggly Wiggly, a name chosen simply because it sounded cheerful. It was a revolution. Within weeks, his store's sales multiplied 20-fold. People bought more than ever before. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. By the early 1920s, there were more than 2,600 Piggly Wiggly stores across America. Clarence Saunders had just invented the supermarket. In theaters across the country, audiences watched newsreels of the distant war, grainy black and white images of carnage and trenches. They wanted no part of it. But one man saw an opportunity. J. P. Morgan, Jr. He offered to lend money to Britain and France so they could buy American steel, his steel, on credit. He assembled a consortium of American banks, and together they funneled hundreds of millions to the Allies. By 1916, Morgan's group had lent more than $500 million. It was good business, but also dangerous. If the Allies lost, they would never repay their debts. The entire American banking system could collapse. President Wilson, who had just won re-election on the promise of neutrality, realized that financial neutrality was already impossible. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The war was framed as a crusade for freedom, democracy against tyranny. Patriotism surged. 2 million men volunteered to fight. For industrialists, the war was both a burden and a blessing. Demand exploded. But so did government control. Washington built its own shipyards, paid fair wages, and even nationalized industries that abused the war effort for profit. Employers howled. They called it socialism. Worse still, in cases of labor strikes, the government sided with the workers. even barring owners from their own factories until disputes were resolved. To fund the war, taxes on the rich were raised sharply, but still it wasn't enough. So the government turned to ordinary citizens, and Morgan's bankers helped sell the idea. They called them Liberty Loans, the bonds of freedom. In theaters and on street corners, posters urged Americans to buy. Even Hollywood joined in. Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks, the biggest stars of the day, appeared in patriotic short films, waving the flag and smiling into the camera. "Buy a Liberty bond," Chaplin quipped. "I'll do the rest." It worked. 15 million Americans, factory workers, farmers, secretaries, financed more than half of the nation's war expenses through their savings. When the soldiers came home, many didn't. More than 300,000 had been killed or maimed. But victory brought a new faith. America's capitalism and democracy had proven themselves superior to any system on earth. The guns fell silent in Europe, and America awoke to a new world. One it believed it had mastered. Factories that had once forged weapons now poured out consumer goods. The war had proven that American industry could move mountains, that capitalism itself could win battles. And the millionaires, relieved to see government retreat from their affairs, moved quickly to reclaim their paradise. One by one, the old titans passed. In the summer of 1919, Andrew Carnegie died at the age of 84. The newspapers mourned him as the great philanthropist who began life in poverty. True to his own gospel of wealth, he had given almost everything away, endowing universities, libraries, and cultural institutions across the country. But he had not forgotten his family. His daughter Margaret was named trustee of his foundation, ensuring that the Carnegie legacy would continue under the careful guidance of a Carnegie. For a brief moment, it seemed that America might pause, might reflect on what it had become. But the war had changed people. They wanted speed, progress, comfort, and, above all, money. The strikes that shook post-war America were crushed without mercy. The anarchists and communists who led protests were rounded up. Foreigners without citizenship were deported. A new fear took hold, the fear of revolution. In 1920, the nation turned to Warren G. Harding, a Republican who promised a return to normalcy. Normalcy, in his language, meant the resurrection of laissez-faire, the idea that government had no right to interfere in business. Washington withdrew. Regulation vanished. Taxes on the rich were cut, and the Supreme Court struck down the very law that had once banned child labor. Once again, America was the land of opportunity for those who already had everything. That Christmas, the New York Tribune carried a familiar headline: Rockefeller donates another $100 million. Half would go immediately to raise teachers' salaries, the rest to the Rockefeller Foundation for the well-being of humanity. It was a dazzling gesture, and a reminder of how power had changed its mask. Once, the rich had ruled through their companies. Now, they ruled through their generosity. Philanthropy had become the velvet glove around the iron hand of wealth. The industrial age that had begun with oil and steel was transforming into an age of image, of public relations, marketing, and the careful choreography of virtue. The old empire of capital had not ended.